The last complete sentence Martin Reese ever transmitted was 11 words long. It went out at 17 minutes past 9 on the evening of October 4, 2021, on a company frequency monitored from a trailer south of Fort Nelson, British Columbia, and the dispatcher who logged it stated to investigators in a written account that sits in the file to this day that she has not worked a night shift since. I'm going to give you all 11 words exactly as they were written down before this episode is over. But first you need to understand where that call came from. Because Martin Reese was not the first person to key a microphone inside that particular fold of the Northern Mountains and never be heard from again. He was the sixth. 6 people across 34 years from 1987 to 2021, a guide outfitter with 3 decades in the bush. 2 brothers in a canoe, a mineral exploration geologist carrying a satellite phone, a 67-year-old trapper on a snow machine, a long-distance hiker from Hamburg, and Martin Reese. They never met. They were separated by decades, by seasons, by everything except geography. What they shared was a stretch of ground roughly 70 square miles across, a terrain feature that government radio technicians had quietly mapped as a communications gap years before the first of the 6 ever walked into it, and one final identical detail. Every one of their last transmissions cut off in the middle, not at the end of a message, not after a sign-off, in the middle of a word or in the middle of a thought, as though a hand had come down on a switch. 5 of the 6 were never found. The one who was found turned up in a place that made the man running her search write a single word in the margin of his own report, and I will show you that word, because I do not think he ever expected anyone to read it. Here is what this episode holds, laid out plainly so you know the shape of it. First, the full account of the 1987 disappearance of guide outfitter Vernon Slate, the case that started the pattern, told from the search narrative itself, a document that runs to over 200 pages and includes the original operator's log with the last transmission written down as it came off the air. Second, the 1979 Federal Radio Survey, sheet by sheet, that drew a boundary around this dead zone 8 years before Slate vanished inside it. And the handwritten note an engineer left on that survey that nobody acted on for 4 decades. Third, the identity of the one person among the 6 who was recovered, and the 41 miles of country between where she called from and where she was found, a distance the search file itself calls impossible. Fourth, the timing detail that runs through all 6 cases, a 2-hour window at night that no newspaper account has ever lined up side by side, and what radio propagation engineers told us that window should mean, because what they told us is the opposite of what you would guess. And fifth, the object. Because at 3 of the 6 sites, searchers recovered the caller's own device, intact, working, and positioned in a way that none of them could explain. And that detail, more than any other, is why this episode exists. A word on how this was put together. This channel works from paper. The accounts in this episode come from search and rescue narratives, coroner service findings, and radio logs obtained through access to information requests along with a published record. Some of the documents took over a year to obtain, and some arrived with names blacked out. And where a name is blacked out in the file, it stays blacked out in this episode. Where the file goes silent, I will tell you it goes silent. Where I am inferring, I will say so out loud because the difference between what a document says and what a narrator wants it to say is the difference between a case file and a campfire story. Nobody has ever been charged in connection with any of these 6 cases, and we will not speculate about any individual. 5 of the 6 remain open historical files, which means in practical terms that a tip phoned in tomorrow would still land on someone's desk. Vernon Slate had guided hunters through the country west of the Grayling Trench for 29 autumns, and in all that time, according to the Outfitters Association records for the region, he had never once missed a scheduled radio check. That is the detail his wife Dora gave the Mounties first, before his description, before his route, before anything else. He does not miss the schedule. And you have to understand what that sentence means coming from a guide's wife in that country in that era, because the evening schedule was not a courtesy call. It was the entire safety system. There were no personal locator beacons in the northern bush in 1987, no satellite messengers, no cell coverage within 200 miles. The 9 o'clock schedule was the single thread connecting a man in the mountains to anyone who could help him, and a guide who kept it perfectly for 29 seasons was a man who understood exactly what the thread was worth. In October of 1987, Slate was 54 years old, running a 2-client sheep hunt out of a base camp on the Texas side. His clients that season were a father and son from Pennsylvania, a 51-year-old surgeon and his 23-year-old boy, both experienced hunters, both fit, and their names appear in the file, though they have never appeared in print, and out of respect for the family they will not appear here either. On the 12th of the month, Slate took the party over a saddle and down into the trench itself, a long shadowed trough of ground running north to south, walled by ridges that stand close to 3,000 feet above its floor, a valley deep enough that in mid-October, the sun clears the eastern wall a little after 10 in the morning and drops behind the western wall by 3:30 in the afternoon. His evening schedule was 9 o'clock. At 9:02, the base operator at the outfit's home cabin, a man named in the file as Slate's brother-in-law, heard Slate come up, clear and strong, giving his position and the condition of the horses. The operator wrote the transmission down as it came, which was the habit of the trade, longhand in a coil-bound notebook, and that notebook page is photographed in the file, and the last line of his notation reads as follows: "All fine here, we will be coming out by the..." That is where it ends. Not a fade. Not a crackle that swallowed the rest. The operator described it in his statement as a clean cut, like a needle lifted off a record. He called back for 40 minutes and raised nothing, and then, because it was 1987 and there was nothing else to do, he sat with the set until 2 in the morning, calling every 15 minutes into a frequency that gave him back nothing but the hiss of an empty band. The search that followed lasted 19 days and put, by the Provincial Emergency Program's own accounting, over 400 person days into the trench and the drainages around it, ground crews, a contracted Bell helicopter flying grid lines at 200 feet, and a Royal Canadian Air Force Buffalo out of Comox flying the high passes. On day 6, searchers found the party's horses, all 5 of them, grazing calm and unharmed at the north end of the trench, still saddled, panniers untouched, rifles still in the scabbards. And the search manager's narrative pauses on that detail, because a horse that has been through a wreck, a bear encounter, a fall, anything violent, shows it. Torn rigging, scattered gear, lather, injuries. These horses showed nothing. One of the searchers, a wrangler brought in specifically to handle the recovery, told the file that the animals behaved as if their riders had simply stepped down and walked away, and that 2 of the lead ropes were not broken or slipped but untied, coiled and hung on the saddle horns, which is what a careful man does when he dismounts intending to come back. 2 hunters and a guide who had, among them, close to 50 years of backcountry experience, had come off those horses somewhere in a corridor of ground less than 4 miles wide and left nothing. No camp. No fire ring. No tracks that survived the rain that came on day 8. The file was moved to historical status in 1991. Dora Slate kept the home cabin radio powered on the same frequency until she left the country in 2003, 16 years of an open channel into a silent valley. And the reason this case matters beyond its own sadness is that Vernon Slate was not standing in unknown country when his voice cut out. He was standing in a place the government already had a name for. The mechanism, as far as it can be honestly explained, is this. Radio in the northern bush lives and dies by 2 things, line of sight and the sky. The everyday traffic, the VHF. Traffic the guides and forestry crews and pilots use travels in straight lines at frequencies around 150 megahertz, and a signal like that does not bend around 3,000 feet of rock any more than a flashlight beam does, which means a valley with walls that high is a room with the door shut. The province knew this, because the province had been papering the north with repeater stations through the 70s. Mountaintop relay boxes that catch a weak signal from a valley and throw it onward, and before you sight a repeater you survey the ground it has to cover. In 1979, the Federal Department of Communications ran exactly that kind of coverage survey across the northeast of British Columbia, testing repeater reach ahead of a planned expansion. The field work took 2 crews most of a summer, truck-mounted test transmitters, portable receivers packed to ridgetops, signal strength readings logged in the hundreds across a region the size of a small European country. The survey sheets, which we obtained through an archives request, show the Grayling Trench sitting precisely in the seam between 2 repeaters, the one on the Sylvia Massif to the west and the Latched Station to the east. Each repeater's coverage shades right up to the trench walls and stops. The floor of the trench, on sheet 94 of that survey, is left unshaded. A hole in the map, roughly 70 square miles, where neither machine can hear you. That accounts for VHF. And if this story were only about VHF, it would not be a story at all, because the North is full of terrain shadows, and everyone who works there knows it. But Slate was not on VHF. Slate was on HF, the old long-haul bush band. Frequencies down around 5 megahertz, the kind of signal that does not care about ridges because it goes up, hits the ionosphere, the electrically charged layer of the upper atmosphere that begins about 50 miles overhead and reflects down hundreds of miles away. That is called skywave, and it is why a trapper in a valley in 1987 could talk to a base cabin over a mountain range with a wire antenna strung between 2 trees. HF should climb out of any hole in the ground because the hole is not between you and your listener. The sky is. The engineers who conducted the 79 survey tested HF in the trench as well, almost as an afterthought. 3 test transmissions from the valley floor to a receiving station at Fort Nelson. And their own numbers show it behaving strangely. The logged signal strengths from the trench floor came in between 12 and 20 decibels below what the same equipment produced from comparable valleys tested the same week, which in plain language means the signal arrived at somewhere between 1% and 6% of its expected strength, and the survey attributes this, cautiously, to possible attenuation from mineralized rock in the trench walls. And there is real science under that caution. The ranges around the trench carry magnetite-bearing formations. Iron-rich rock and conductive mineralized ground is known to distort the behavior of antennas and soak up radiated power, a phenomenon documented since the 1950s in mining regions from Sudbury to the Iron Range of Minnesota, where prospectors learned that certain ground simply eats signal. It is a legitimate mechanism. It is also, and the survey's own engineer seems to have understood this, an incomplete one, because absorption weakens a signal gradually. With distance and geometry, it does not switch a signal off in the middle of a word. The report calls the readings anomalous and recommends a resurvey. The resurvey never happened, and the paper trail tells you why in the dullest possible way. A 1980 budget memo in the same archives box deferring the Northeast expansion's second phase, and then the Department of Communications itself was reorganized out of existence in the 90s, and the sheets went into a box, and the box went to Ottawa. And in the margin of sheet 94, next to the unshaded floor of the trench, there is a note in pencil, initialed RH, which we have been able to match to a propagation engineer named on the survey's cover page, a man who, as best we can determine, retired in 1992 and died in 2008 without ever being asked about it. And the note reads, "Gap does not behave like terrain shadow. Recommend full resurvey before any station sitting." One line, written 8 years before Vernon Slate's voice stopped in the middle of a word, in the exact ground that line describes. So when Slate cut out, the honest explanation available was that the trench simply eats radio, and that whatever happened to him afterward, an injury, a river, the ordinary cruelty of that country, happened in silence because silence is what the trench is made of. That explanation held up reasonably well. It held up until 1993. Dale and Peter Hablashek were 29 and 26 years old, brothers from Prince George, a heavy-duty mechanic and a sawmill electrician, and in August of 1993 they were 16 days into a canoe descent of the Grayling River, which threads the floor of the trench for 11 miles. They were careful men by every account, the kind of paddlers who portaged rapids other people ran, and their route plan, filed with the Flying Service in Watson Lake, shows they knew about the dead zone, because they marked it in ink with the words "No radio here" and built their schedule around it, arranging their check-ins for before the trench and after it, with the Treeline cabin at mile 40 as the one exception, because the cabin had something their boat did not. On the evening of August 21st, they pulled in at that cabin, a registered Treeline cabin equipped with a fixed HF set running off a bank of batteries and a proper long wire antenna, 100 and some feet of copper strung high between spruce poles, far stronger than anything carried on a boat, an installation that the Treeline's owner had used for years and that had a documented history of working from that exact spot. That detail matters, and I want you to hold on to it. This was not a marginal radio in a marginal place. This was a proven station inside the dead zone, one of the few, positioned where the valley opens just enough to let a long wire breathe. At 8:43, an operator at the flying service heard Dale Havlicek come up on the Treeline frequency, relaxed, laughing, reporting that the river was low and the bugs were worse than advertised, and the operator, who gave a statement 2 days later, recalled that Dale was mid-sentence, describing their planned start time for the morning. The operator's log records the transmission ending mid-sentence at 8:46. Same clean cut. She called back, raised nothing, assumed the cabin's batteries had died, and made a note to mention it when the brothers checked in from the far side of the trench. They never did. The cabin was reached by float plane 2 days later. The canoe was pulled out properly and tied with the painter in a neat figure 8. The gear was inside. Food hung from the ridgepole against bears, boots by the stove, 2 sleeping bags rolled out but never slept in. The radio was still switched on, tuned to the working frequency, batteries healthy, and when the pilot keyed the microphone to test it, Watson Lake heard him perfectly. The set was fine. It had always been fine, and the cabin's door was latched from the outside, which means that whatever pulled 2 grown men away from a warm stove and an open radio channel in the last light of an August evening, they, or someone, closed the door behind them on the way out. The search put boats on 11 miles of river and divers in the 2 pools deep enough to hold a body. Neither brother has ever been found. 11 years passed. In July of 2004, Mireille Fontaine, a 34-year-old exploration geologist from Rouen, Noranda, was sampling in the trench for a junior mining company, and it is worth pausing on why a mining company was in there at all, because it closes a loop in this story. They were chasing the same mineralization, the same iron-rich formations that the 1979 survey had blamed for the strange radio readings. The anomaly and the ore body may be the same rock. Fontaine was alone at a fly camp, an accepted practice in the industry at the time, though it would not survive the safety reforms of the following decade, and she was carrying something the first 3 victims never had: a satellite phone, a device that does not need repeaters or the ionosphere or a wire between trees, only a sliver of open sky and a constellation of satellites passing overhead. At 8:40 on the evening of July 9th, she called her project office in Smithers, a routine check, described by the office manager as entirely normal, samples bagged, weather fine, helicopter pickup confirmed for the 12th, and the office recorded the time the call dropped. Mid-word at 8:44. Satellite phones drop calls in deep terrain, that is true. The phone needs line of sight to a moving satellite, and the trench at her camp is narrow enough that the visible sky is a thin ribbon, so a drop call meant nothing. Nobody panicked for a day. Then she missed 2 schedules, and the search began, and it became, by person hours, the largest search in the history of that district. And Mireille Fontaine became the only one of the 6 who was ever found. 5 weeks later, a helicopter crew on a fire patrol not even searching spotted her 41 miles to the east, across 2 full drainages in a mountain pass that stands over 6,000 feet, ground that experienced searchers, per the file, would allow a strong and equipped traveler 5 to 7 days to cross, and that estimate assumes boots, food, and a route. She had no pack, no boots, and no injuries that the coroner's service could attribute to a fall. Her feat in the coroner's finding addresses this directly because everyone who read the file asked the same question, showed damage consistent with sustained travel over rough ground, but not 5 to 7 days of it, and the pathologist declined to estimate how far she had actually walked, writing only that the findings were, in his words, difficult to reconcile with the recovery location. The formal finding was death by exposure, undetermined circumstances, which is the coroner's service saying in its precise institutional language that it knows what killed her and cannot account for anything else. Her camp, when it was finally located, was intact, stove assembled, samples labeled in her own handwriting through the afternoon of July 9th, satellite phone sitting in its case with a charged battery, and the company's call records confirm the phone was never used again after 8:44. The search manager's typed report walks through the timeline with professional flatness, but on the page where he calculates the distance against her last known position, someone in the same hand that signed the report has written one word in the margin. Impossible. We contacted that search manager in 2023. He's retired now, and he confirmed the handwriting was his, and when we asked what he meant by it, he was quiet for a moment, and then said he meant exactly what it says, and that he had run or assisted on over 90 searches in his career, and that hers was the only file he never made peace with. Then, in February of 2011, Aldo Kask, 67, a trapper who had worked a registered line on the east wall of the trench for over 30 years, made his nightly radio telephone call to his wife from his line cabin at 4 minutes past 9, told her the Martin were moving and that he would start out in the morning, and cut off mid-sentence at 9:09. His wife Alvie was not initially alarmed, because the radio telephone service in that country was temperamental in cold weather, and it was 31 below that night. She reported him overdue 2 days later. His snow machine was found 3 days after that at the trench floor, well off his registered line, in a place his wife said he had no reason to be, out of fuel, having idled itself dry, which the mechanics who examined it estimated would have taken between 4 and 6 hours from a full tank, meaning the machine sat there, running, warm, lights on, for most of a winter night with nobody on it. His trail in the snow ran to the machine. No trail ran away from it, though searchers noted wind had worked the snow by the time they arrived. Aldo Kask has never been found. But something of his was, and it is the first appearance of the detail I told you about at the start, the object, and I want to set it out for you properly alongside the 2 other times it happened, when searchers worked outward from Kask's snow machine. One of them found his handheld radio a quarter-mile away, and the find is photographed in the file, because the searcher refused to move it until it was photographed, and his reasoning, given in his statement, is worth quoting nearly whole. He said he had recovered dropped gear from 100 scenes, and dropped gear lies how it falls, and this did not lie how it falls. The radio was not dropped. It was standing upright on the flat top of a cut stump, switched on, volume high, facing west into the open trench, as though it had been placed there to listen. The photograph shows it centered on the stump, antenna vertical, with snow banked evenly around its base, and the searcher noted there were no tracks within the radius his eye could read, though again, wind and days had passed. When that photograph went into the file, somebody pulled the Slate documents from 1987 because there was an unresolved note in them. In the summer of 1988, a year after Slate vanished, a hunting party had turned in a handheld radio found in the trench, and the party's letter, preserved in the file, describes finding it set upright on a flat rock, aerial vertical, as if left on purpose, and the letter adds a detail the 1988 investigators had no reason to weigh, that the rock sat in open ground, away from any trail, and that the radio faced out into the valley. It was confirmed as Slate's spare by its serial number against the outfit's equipment list. At the time that was read as an oddity of chance, gear scattered by an animal, maybe, or dropped and propped by a freeze and thaw. Set beside the Kask photograph, it reads differently. And then it happened a third time. In September of 2016, Lena Brand, a 27-year-old long-distance hiker from Hamburg, a physiotherapist who had already walked the length of Scandinavia and kept a quiet, careful trail journal that her family later shared with investigators, was 11 weeks into a solo traverse of the northern ranges. Her journal shows she knew the trench's reputation for dead air because her entry 2 days before, the last entry, notes that she expected no messages out for 3 days and had told her father not to worry. At 9:05 at night, she activated the emergency function on her satellite messenger from the floor of the trench. 5 did coordinates and then, according to the service provider's own data log, stopped mid-burst before the message field completed. A failure mode the provider's technicians and correspondents included in the file described as rare, and rare is their word because the transmission burst on that class of device lasts under a second, and interrupting it mid-packet requires the signal path to fail within a window of milliseconds. Searchers reached the coordinates within 18 hours. Fast, because an SOS from a lone hiker moves machinery that a missed radio schedule does not. Lena Brandt was not there, her messenger was. He was standing upright on a stump, screen facing outward into the valley, 60% battery, in working order. And when a technician later triggered its test function, it transmitted perfectly from a bench in Vancouver. Her pack was found 90 feet away, upright, leaned against a deadfall, closed. 3 separate decades, 3 separate people who never knew each other's names. 3 devices, each one found placed, vertical and deliberate, at the edge of the same 70 square miles of silence, each one facing into it. The RCMP has never offered a public explanation for the placements, and the files, to their credit, do not manufacture one. Neither will I. I will tell you the explanations that have been proposed because you are owed them. Investigators have floated hypothermic paradoxical behavior, the documented tendency of freezing people to do irrational, ritualistic things in their final hours, and it is a real phenomenon, and it might account for one placement. It strains badly across 3 decades in 3 seasons, including a September night above freezing. Others have suggested the victims deliberately staged their devices to catch a signal, propping a radio high and open-faced, and that is plausible too, except that in all 3 cases the device was left behind by someone who then traveled onward without it, away from the one object that could save them. Every explanation covers one detail and dies on the next. But there is one more pattern across the 6 cases that has never, as far as we can find, been printed in one place, and it is the hour. Slate cut out at 9:02, the Havlicek brothers at 8:46, Fontaine at 8:44, Kask at 9:09, Brandt at 9:05, and Martin Reese, whose case we are about to finish, at 9:17. Every one of the 6, across 34 years and every season of the year, lost their signal inside the same 33-minute band of the evening. And before you reach for the obvious answer that people simply make their calls at night, sit with what these cases actually are. Fontaine's call was a scheduled office check that could have fallen anywhere in the evening. Brandt's was an emergency activation, unscheduled by definition, triggered by whatever was happening to her in that moment. Kask called his wife when he got in from the line, a time that varied, per L.V. Kask's statement, by 2 hours or more night to night. The schedules varied. The cutoffs did not. We put that timing to 2 radio propagation engineers, one a retired industry consultant with 40 years in northern communications, the other an academic who studies high-latitude ionospheric behavior, and both told us independently, essentially, the same thing. For HF radio, the hours after dark are when the ionosphere settles and signals carry further and cleaner, not worse. The sun's radiation builds an absorptive layer in the lower ionosphere during the day, the D layer, and after sunset that layer dissolves, which is why the same 5 MHz signal that struggles at noon can cross a continent at 10 at night, and why bush operators have always favored evening schedules in the first place. If the trench were only a hole in the radio map, they said, you would expect the failures scattered across the day and weighted toward daylight when absorption is at its worst. A cluster at night, one of them wrote to us, and I am quoting his email with his permission, is not what terrain does. Terrain does not know what time it is. That is the hidden line in this story. The dead zone should be at its weakest at the exact hour it took every single one of them. Which brings us back to October 4th, 2021, and Martin Reese. He was 42, a line-clearing contractor from Dawson Creek, a former wildland firefighter. Married, 2 kids, camped alone at the south entrance of the trench ahead of a survey job for a proposed communications corridor, which is its own bitter irony because the job that put him there was the first stage of the project, meant to finally close the coverage gap. His company ran disciplined communications, a mandatory schedule every night at 9:15, on a recorded frequency with a live dispatcher, and Reese's record with the company showed 100% schedule compliance across 4 seasons. At 9:16, the dispatcher in the trailer south of Fort Nelson heard him come up, calm, on schedule. He confirmed his position. He confirmed the weather. Clear, -2, no wind. And then, at 9:17, in an even voice on a recorded frequency, Martin Reese transmitted the 11 words, "Something is standing at the edge of the light. Stand by." The recording, which was reviewed by investigators and described in the file, holds 9 more seconds of open carrier after that. 9 seconds in which his microphone was still keyed and he was not speaking, and the file notes that the audio in those 9 seconds was analyzed and contains no voices, no footfalls, no identifiable sound beyond the low background of an open channel. And then the transmission ends mid-carrier, the same cut as 1987, as 1983, as all of them. The dispatcher called back for the rest of her shift. His camp was reached the next morning by helicopter. Dinner was on the stove, burned dry, which the investigators used to anchor the timeline, because the propane bottle attached to it was empty, and the burn time of that bottle from the fill level. His receipts documented, brackets the stove going untended from roughly the time of the call. His headlamp was on the table, switched on, battery dead. His truck, parked at the staging area 4 miles south, was locked, keys never found. His radio has never been found, and neither has he. I want to be careful here, because this channel does not deal in monsters, and I owe these 6 people better than a campfire flourish. An animal at the edge of a fire is not a strange thing in that country. Moose, bear, wolf, a porcupine throwing a big shadow. Every camp in the north gets visitors, and every experienced hand narrates them over an open mic exactly the way Reese did, calmly, with a standby, meaning I will check this and come right back. A tired man doing that is not a strange thing either. What is strange, what remains strange after every allowance is made, is everything around those words. The hour, the same hour as the other 5, on a schedule whose timing was set by a company that had never heard of Vernon Slate. The cut, mid-carrier, on a recorded commercial system with no fault ever identified per the company's own technical review, which tested the repeater path end-to-end and found it healthy, and the 70 square miles under his boots. Flagged in pencil by an engineer in 1979 as a gap that does not behave like terrain. There is one late piece of the record worth adding, because it is the closest thing this story has to an official answer. In 2022, following the Reese file, the province quietly commissioned a new coverage study of the trench, the resurvey that engineer R.H. asked for 43 years earlier, conducted this time with instruments R.H. could not have imagined, calibrated software-defined receivers, drone-borne antennas, continuous logging over 11 days rather than 3 spot tests. We obtain the summary. It confirms the VH shadow, nearly identical in outline to sheet 94, because rock does not move. It confirms weak and inconsistent HFF performance, consistent with mineralized terrain, and it even quantifies the absorption in figures broadly matching the 1979 readings. And it states in its own words that no measured anomaly accounts for abrupt mid-transmission signal loss reported in historical incidents. In plain language, the modern instruments found a quiet valley, but not a switch. 11 days of continuous listening found nothing that turns off. The report recommends that travelers in the corridor carry redundant satellite communication and file trip plans, which is sound advice anywhere in that country, and if you travel remote ground, it is advice worth taking regardless of what you make of this story, because whatever the trench is, the ordinary North kills people every year without any mystery at all. So here's where the ledger stands. 6 people, 34 years. 6 transmissions cut in the middle, all inside one 33-minute window of the evening from one unshaded hole on a 1979 survey sheet. One person recovered, 41 miles from where any calculation says she could be. 3 devices found standing upright, placed, facing the silence. 5 families still waiting, the Slates, the Havliceks, the Casks, the Brants, the Reeses, and it is for them, more than for the mystery, that this episode was made. Because an open file is not a story to the people who carry it, it is a room in the house that never gets warm. The trench is still there. The frequency Doris Slate monitored for 16 years is still allocated, and somewhere in an archive box in Ottawa, a pencil note from 1979 is still right about something nobody has ever been able to name. If cases like this one matter to you, told from the record and with respect for the people inside them, subscribe to the Treeline tapes and leave a like so these files reach the people still hoping someone remembers. I will see you at the Treeline.